Mr. Sanders. Mr. Heinrich.
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Hirono.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. King. Ms. Cortez Basto.
Aye.
Mr. Kelly.
Aye.
Mr. Hickenlooper.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Barrasso.
Aye.
Mr. Risch.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee.
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines.
Aye.
Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Langford.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Marshall.
Aye.
That's right, 18-1, because we're missing. On this vote, the ayes are 18 and the noes are 1.
That concludes our business meeting, and we will report Mr. Boudreau out. And we'll now turn to our hearing this morning. And with that, we have a tremendous lineup today, and the distinguished panel of witnesses with us. We have Ms. Amanda Lefton, the Director of the Bureau of Ocean Management. We have Governor John Bel Edwards of Louisiana. We have Mike Minrovic, the President and CEO of Arena Energy. And we have Russell Holmes, the Director of the Center for Offshore Safety and retired Coast Guard Captain. With that, we'll start, first of all, with an introduction from Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Barrasso, for holding this hearing. I welcome today the Democratic governor of my state, Governor John Bel Edwards. Governor Edwards and I are of different parties, but without usurping his testimony, I can say that we both recognize it is a false choice between environmental stewardship and energy development. We in Louisiana understand you gotta balance both. The reason I know he's gonna say this is, in a sense, because he sent a letter to President Biden, quote, our ability to address Louisiana's climate-related challenges, improve our structural resilience to catastrophic weather events, combat coastal land loss, and reduce our carbon footprint relies heavily on sustainable and predictable oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico. Offshore energy production and environmental resiliency is not a partisan issue in Louisiana. Governor Edwards and I have worked together as to best position our state for the energy transition occurring while recognizing that oil and gas will continue to be an important part of U.S. energy mix for years to come. We work together because of climate change, impacting Louisiana unlike any other state in the nation. And we have the largest climate adaptation plan, which under his leadership is helping to fight coastal erosion. The revenue that we receive from this energy production off our shore is so critical to this effort. Unfortunately, the current posture of the Biden administration threatens our long-term ability to fund these projects while putting tens of thousands of jobs at risk. You said it, Senator Barrasso, eliminating U.S. production does not reduce global demand. Energy will still be produced, but not with American energy and emission standards, produced by other nations with non-existent emission or laxly enforced emission standards. Strengthening those nations while Americans lose their jobs and global greenhouse gases go up is not a policy to endorse. We need an energy policy rooted in science, which actually accomplishes worthy goals, not something that sounds like you really care. It gets awards from activist groups, but puts hard-working Americans out of work. Solutions are needed which move us in the right direction. Thanks again for holding the hearing. I thank Governor Edwards for coming up and all the witnesses. I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. And now we're going to move to our first witness, will be Ms. Lefton. Ms. Lefton, your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. I am very pleased to appear before you today to discuss BOEM's role in developing America's energy resources on the Outer Continental Shelf, or the OCS. My name is Amanda Lefton. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and I am honored to have assumed this role and responsibility of guiding the Bureau as it fulfills its mission to develop America's offshore energy and mineral resources in an environmentally and economically sustainable way. As part of tackling the climate crisis, the administration is committed to advancing the nation's transition to a clean energy future. During his first week in office, President Biden issued Executive Order 14008, which directed the Department of Interior to review processes for renewable energy siting. On March 29th, the Departments of Interior, Energy, and Commerce all together committed to a target to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and announced a series of initiatives that collectively demonstrate an all-of-government approach that will catalyze the offshore wind industry in the United States and create nearly 80,000 jobs. BOEM's delegated authority to manage renewable energy development on the OCS gives us a critical role in implementing the administration's offshore wind plan. Leasing activities to date include 8 competitive lease sales, 17 active commercial-scale wind energy leases, and we have received 14 industry-submitted project development proposals and 2 research leases to date. Just this week, excitingly, Secretary Haaland and Secretary Raimondo together announced the approval of the Vineyard Wind Project. This is the first large-scale offshore wind project in U.S. waters. Construction and operations of the 800-megawatt Vineyard Wind Energy Project will create 3,600 jobs and will be built by union labor, ensuring that advancing offshore wind is not only fighting climate change, but supporting the American workforce. On March 29th, the Department of Interior announced that BOEM will finalize the New York Bight Wind Energy Area. BOEM has also submitted notices of intent to prepare environmental impact statements for Ocean Wind and Revolution Wind, and also has ongoing environmental impact statements for South Fork. These advancements are truly a product of both BOEM's diligent work to elevate environmental and multiple use considerations, and our robust engagement with the industry, tribal governments, a variety of partners and stakeholders, and state and local governments. We anticipate continued interest and growth in renewable energy on the OCS in years to come as we advance the administration's critical energy agenda and work to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 to fight climate change and create good-paying jobs. I look forward to working with all of you to ensure our offshore renewable energy resources are developed efficiently, responsibly, and equitably. BOEM is also the primary agency charged with OCS marine minerals, such as sand and gravel, and is responsible for leasing these resources. To date, our marine minerals program has largely focused on beach nourishment and coastal restoration projects, but we are also examining the potential for sustainable production of critical minerals in the OCS. Executive Order 14008 directs the Department of Interior to pause new oil and gas leasing on public lands and offshore waters pending a comprehensive review of federal oil and gas programs. This directive is limited to leasing. It does not impact production or plans or permit applications submitted under valid existing leases. Such applications continue to be reviewed and approved. The directive also does not apply to state lands or lands that the United States holds in trust or restricted status for tribes. The executive order does provide an important opportunity to review our oil and gas program to ensure that it serves the American public and to restore the balance on America's public lands and water to benefit current and future generation. In undertaking this review, BOEM is considering whether royalties and other fiscal terms amount to a fair return to the taxpayer, and it is incorporating the corresponding costs to climate change and the environment, ensuring that our actions respect our government-to-government relationships with tribal nations, and of course, committing to the principles of environmental justice in our decision-making. We expect to complete this review in a timely manner, but do not have an exact time frame for completion. An interim report to describe our focus and next steps for the review will be released in early summer. Input received from a March 25th virtual forum that included perspectives from industry, tribes, academia, labor, and other organizations, as well as over 100,000 written public input will also be summarized in that report. President Biden also issued an executive order which directs the federal government to be guided by science and also ensures the integrity of it in our federal decision-making. Secretary Haaland also issued an executive order which provides guidance for that. While these orders issued a renewed focus on and respect for the importance and value that science brings to our government and decision-making, BOEM has, of course, always been guided by rigorous scientific research as a foundation for our decision-making, and that will, of course, continue with rigor. As Secretary Haaland stated previously, we've put off the transition to clean energy for generations. Now the offshore wind industry has the potential to create tens of thousands of good-paying, family-supporting jobs. BOEM plays a vital role in advancing safe and responsible offshore energy development, and we are committed to active engagement with all stakeholders, partners, including members of this committee, moving forward. I look forward to our continued work together and to answering your questions today. Thank you very much. I'm grateful for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Lefton. And now we're going to hear from Governor Edwards. Governor Edwards?
Thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, Senator Cassidy for the introduction. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today on the issue of federal offshore oil and gas development. As you all know, I'm a governor of an energy-producing state, but also a state that's on the front lines of climate crisis. Because of oil and gas development is occurring in the Gulf of Mexico, immediately adjacent to our coast, Louisiana is directly affected and unquestionably impacted by the federal policies regarding oil and gas production. And I'm here today to urge the Congress and the administration to do two things. First, resume Gulf leasing for the exploration of oil and gas by the third quarter of this year. And number two, to increase the revenue coming from oil and gas production, returning to coastal states to better address the impacts of climate change and protect our coastal communities. Climate change is a serious threat to Louisiana. It's impacting our state in two major ways. First, we're experiencing stronger, wetter, and more frequent hurricanes and other storm events. Last summer and early fall, Louisiana was hit by 4 hurricanes. That's a record in modern times. 2 of the hurricanes, Laura and Delta, made landfall less than 15 miles apart and followed roughly the same path across southwestern Louisiana. Laura was the strongest hurricane to hit the state since the 1850s and actually was at hurricane strength as it approached Arkansas. That's never happened before. Our people are still recovering from the devastation of these storms. The second major impact is sea level rise, which is aggravating our effort to protect and restore our coastal wetlands. Louisiana's lost approximately 2,000 square miles of coastal wetlands since the 1930s. Since the 1990s, however, both our people in our state and local leadership have been committed on a bipartisan basis to the task of protecting and restoring our critically important coastal wetlands. We've established the agency, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, to lead this effort, and we have developed through a public and science-based process a master plan for a 50-year, $50 billion program to protect and restore our coastal wetlands. Last year, through an executive order, I established the Climate Initiatives Task Force consisting of 23 leading experts from our state. The task force will produce a suite of recommendations in February 2022. Today, the task force is exploring carbon capture, utilization, and storage, wind power generation in our offshore waters and the federal offshore waters, and the development and deployment of hydrogen as a possible future-based fuel. My executive order also adopted for the state the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This is an ambitious goal, but it's what the global scientific community says is necessary if we want to avoid the most severe impacts from climate change. Our most recent economic development announcement in Louisiana is a $1 billion renewable diesel refinery, taking non-fossil fuels, in fact, pine tree waste, with carbon capture and sequestration integrated into that operation. It'll be carbon negative when it's done. So we're committed to these goals. But at the same time, we are a major oil and gas producing state. Louisiana's 2 liquefied natural gas terminals shipped 55% of the country's LNG exports last year. We are home to a substantial portion of the nation's refining and petrochemical capacity, and most of the support industries and workers for oil and gas development in federal waters in the Gulf of Mexico are located in our state. The oil and gas produced offshore moves onshore through pipelines that cross our coastline. The oil and gas industry, refining and petrochemical industry, and offshore support industries together are a foundational cornerstone part of our state's economy. An abrupt halt or precipitous reduction or prolonged pause to federal offshore oil and gas production would be devastating to our economy and would leave many of the onshore impacts of federal offshore oil and gas development unaddressed. In order for Louisiana to experience an orderly and responsible energy transition, even for the nation and our economy to be able to transition responsibly, federal oil and gas production must continue in the Gulf and well into the future. We also must continue to receive federal impact assistance for that production. By constitutional amendment, all federal revenue sharing from oil and gas production off of our coast is committed to the protection and restoration of our coastal wetlands and flood protection for Louisiana citizens. Indeed, the federal impact assistance we receive must be increased to be more closely in parity with federal impact assistance for onshore federal energy development. 2 weeks ago, your hearing was focused on oil and gas development on federal lands. Impact assistance for that energy development is an even 50-50 split between the federal treasury and the host states. Production from the Gulf of Mexico, which accounts for 17% of U.S. crude production and 5% of all U.S. natural gas, only provided 6.8% to the Gulf Coast host states. So while $457.5 million went to Wyoming and $707 million to New Mexico, only $249 million was shared by all 4 Gulf states. I commend Senator Cassidy for working with Senator Whitehouse and others on new legislation to reflect an updated approach to revenue sharing, which covers revenue from offshore wind energy production and appropriately updates revenue sharing from the Gulf of Mexico, begun under laws passed by this committee in 2006. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to testify today on these vital issues. We are committed to addressing climate change responsibly and to an orderly energy transition, but we must find a way to take a balanced and responsible approach where we're producing clean oil and gas while also mitigating the causes of climate change. Environmentally responsible oil and gas production must be allowed to continue on the outer continental shelf in the Gulf of Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Edwards. And now we're going to hear from Mr. Holmes.
Good morning, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso.
Turn your mic on. There you go.
Good morning, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. My name is Russell Holmes, and I'm the Director of the Center for Offshore Safety, known as COS. COS was established in 2011 with the mission to advance offshore safety. COS is leading the industry to perform optimally, and we are on the right path toward making that happen through the Safety and Environmental Management Systems Program, known as SEMS. Prior to joining COS last year, I served for 27 years in the United States Coast Guard, where I had the privilege of facilitating commerce while ensuring the marine transportation system operated safely, reliably, and securely. In my last assignment, I was the Coast Guard's lead regulator, overseeing offshore oil and gas safety, security, and environmental compliance. With the recent cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline, it is important to note at the outset that cybersecurity is a top priority, and our industry leaders are engaged on a continuous basis with government agencies to mitigate risk and fully understanding the evolving threat landscape. The events this week demonstrate the vital importance of U.S. offshore and onshore, along with the pipeline infrastructure of all the oil and gas, to be able to deliver safe, reliable, and affordable energy to keep our economy running. U.S. offshore oil and gas production is a significant source of energy for the nation and the world, which is why its safe and reliable production has become the centerpiece of the industry's continued work on the outer continental shelf. The Gulf of Mexico has long been a key producing region for the United States. In 2020, Gulf of Mexico production accounted for 15% of U.S. oil production and 2% of gas production, lowering our dependence on foreign energy sources. Additionally, offshore operations bring substantial economic benefits to the Gulf region and the country. Offshore exploration and production support hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs and is conducted under some of the most stringent safety and environmental regulations in the world. Offshore exploration and production also contribute billions of dollars to federal and state governments every year, which support important programs like education, infrastructure, and conservation efforts. In 2019 alone, the Department of the Interior dispersed nearly $12 billion from energy production on federal lands and waters to United States and state governments. In addition, earlier this month, DOI announced $1.6 billion to address critical deferred maintenance projects and improve transportation and recreation infrastructure in national parks, national wildlife refuge and recreation areas, and at Bureau of Indian Education schools. This funding through the Great American Outdoors Act, advanced through this committee, is provided by energy development on federal lands and water. While there are vast benefits of U.S. offshore oil and gas exploration and production, it is essential to produce these natural resources while ensuring the safety of the offshore workforce and protection of the environment. Due in large part to industry leadership and the lessons learned over the past decade, industry has remained focused on enhancing its ability to protect workers, prevent, intervene, and respond to any spill with the most effective mitigation measures possible. With this in mind, industry has made significant advancements to promote safety culture, develop and revise industry standards to minimize and prevent accidents and spills, track, report, and learn from incidents, develop and improve subsea containment and intervention capabilities, mitigate environmental impacts of spills through greater spill response technology, enhance safety and environmental management systems, and establish the support of the efforts of the Center for Offshore Safety. It is with this focus that COS is now entering its second decade of service, formed to help offshore operations improve safety, protect the environment, and increase sustainability on the OCS through peer learning opportunities, sharing of good practices, and SEMS certificate program. This program was established based on API recommended practice for development of a safety and environmental management program for offshore operations and facilities. Industries and COS's work has led to continued advancements in technology, new and improved industry standards, and enhanced best practices, advances in risk management, smarter regulations, and innovative approaches to addressing offshore safety. Continuous improvements occur through learning, collaborating, and innovating, and the offshore oil and gas industry remains committed to following through on its responsibility to operate in a safe and environmentally sound manner. Together, with changes being made by federal regulators, the collective action has served to improve and will continually improve the safety of offshore energy development. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today, and I am happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. And now we're going to have Mr. Marovic. I try to get it right. I don't know how close I am to it.
Is Menarvic.
Menarvic,
Yes,
see?
sir.
I was close.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources for the opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Mike Menarvic, and I'm CEO of Arena Energy, an independent exploration and production company with exclusive focus on the federal waters of the Gulf of Mexico. For 22 years, Arena has been drilling wells in the Gulf and has invested over $4 billion of capital. And during that time, we paid the federal government $1.1 billion in royalties alone. We've decommissioned over 300 wells and 45 platforms. And during the last 10 years, we've been one of the most active drillers in the Gulf of Mexico. We conduct our operations with an intense focus on safety and have produced significant volumes of oil and natural gas in an environmentally responsible manner. Our operations support thousands of jobs along the Gulf Coast and throughout the country. I also speak to you today on behalf of the Gulf Energy Alliance, which is a coalition of leading independent offshore producers. These are not household names, but we are the backbone of the offshore industry. In 2019, independents collectively produced approximately half of the oil and natural gas from the Gulf and provided half of the total offshore revenues paid to the U.S. Treasury. For 70 years, the United States Gulf of Mexico has been a world-class basin for oil and gas development and for U.S. energy security. The Gulf Coast residents in adjacent states of Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi overwhelmingly support offshore energy development, which contributes to local communities with high-paying jobs. From 2003 to 2019, U.S. offshore production contributed $107 billion to the U.S. Treasury through royalties, lease bonuses, and rentals. 17%, about 17% of every dollar of revenue goes straight back to the federal government and various state programs, including Land and Water Conservation Fund, the Great American Outdoors Acts, and Go Mesa. Finally, the extensive infrastructure in the Gulf represents promising opportunities for emerging technologies in support of a lower carbon future, including offshore wind, hydrogen fuel generation, and storage of captured carbon. And on top of all that, the oil produced in the Gulf of Mexico is among the most environmentally advantaged in the entire world. Oil and gas will remain critical fuel sources for decades to come. As we transition to a less carbon-intensive energy sources, we should not reduce or constrain oil production from the Gulf of Mexico. Doing so will not impact domestic demand. It will simply force us to meet U.S. oil demand by importing foreign crude with significantly higher greenhouse gas emissions than that produced in the Gulf of Mexico. The U.S. still imports about 6 million barrels of crude every day, and a recent Wood Mackenzie report shows that the largest U.S. crude importers, including Canada, Mexico, Colombia, Nigeria, Russia, and Iraq, have significantly higher greenhouse gas emissions than U.S. offshore. This report highlighted greenhouse gas emissions from these countries of 1.5 to 3.4 times the Gulf of Mexico greenhouse gas emissions on a per barrel basis. Why is the Gulf of Mexico so much better? There's 5 main reasons. One, because offshore operations have been stringently regulated for more than 70 years by the U.S. federal government, and that's not necessarily the case for those other 6 countries. Venting and flaring of natural gas is very limited and is tightly regulated in the offshore. The control and monitoring of potential greenhouse gas lease points is the key, and most offshore facilities produce very high oil production volumes into centrally located platforms, resulting in much smaller footprints where we can manage those emissions. And the use of leading-edge processing technology for gas detection, methane capture, and reduced emissions that we implement on those platforms is also key. And finally, there's an extensive existing pipeline network that eliminates the need for any shipping or trucking of our oil. We put it in the pipelines, it goes onshore, ends up in a refinery, and there's no significant exposure to the atmosphere. After 70 years and 55,000 wells have been drilled in the Gulf of Mexico, we still find new sizable opportunities to drill. One of the biggest advancements enabling new resource discovery is simply the improvements in computing speed, which we're all so familiar. As better seismic and reprocessing techniques open up new drilling opportunities, it is uncertain where those resources might reside. So all of the Gulf acreage needs to be available to lease. The recent pause on federal lease sales has had an immediate and chilling effect on offshore oil and gas producers, forcing companies, shareholders, and capital providers to seriously rethink their long-term commitment to the Gulf. I believe that more uncertainty creates lower investment, and that both investment and oil production have already been impaired or reduced. The result of a continued pause or an outright ban will be more imports sourced from areas of the world where oil will be produced under much lower environmental standards. Let's move towards a significant lower carbon future, and let's get there as quickly as we can. But during the transition, we should ensure that we maximize the distinct economic, security, and environmental advantages of energy production from the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all of you for your opening statements, and now we're going to begin with our questions. And my first question is, Mr. Holmes, we're having this discussion almost 11 years after the BP Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill. That accident had enormous financial, environmental, and human costs, and it's important to keep in mind that 11 people lost their lives. So, can you walk us through what has changed since then, and have we ensured that it won't happen again? And on follow-up on that, is there more to be done? We're still working to ensure that, or do you feel confident that we have come to full circle now to make sure this is not going to happen again?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Manchin. I think we continue to learn every day. Part of my role at the Center for Offshore Safety is how can we do better tomorrow than we did today, and how can we continue to constantly learn. And that's why the Center for Offshore Safety exists, to be able to learn from catastrophes and disasters like the Deepwater incident that happened. And how can we continue to
Just tell us what the Deepwater, what happened? What blow up? No, I mean, what caused all this damage? And then what have you done to prevent it from happening again?
Certainly. So on that day, April 20th, 2010, 11 people tragically lost their life when the Deepwater Horizon was drilling a well or dealing with a well in the Macondo area, and they lost control of it from a pressure perspective, and the well became uncontrollable. And it took, talking to people in the industry, I've had people, but before I took the position in the Center for Offshore Safety when I was in the Coast Guard as well, and a lot of people talked about, there were so many different things that went wrong in that incident that could have prevented and stopped that.
Was it a lack of inspection, lack of oversight, or just a lack of negligence, just negligence on the part of the driller?
So if you ever look at, if one of the studies, when you look at for causality analysis, you hear a Swiss cheese model, where you try not to line up, you try to have different barriers in place and mitigation things in place that in every part of the way, between a process perspective, your equipment, your different barriers, and your different aspects. And every now and then, when an accident and an incident happens, all these different barriers and mitigation measures that you had in place, the one time that there might be a vulnerability in that piece or component of it lines up with the next one, with the next one, and the next one.
And I hate to rush you along because we don't have so much time, but let me just ask this. Have we been able to put in place since then so we don't have a runaway well like this again where this could happen?
Yes.
What type of equipment or technology has been improved?
We have improved, we have written over 250 new standards to improve how we do our different processes across the board. We have developed newer and improved technologies for to be able to drill, how we're being able to mitigate, how be able to prevent the blowout preventers. We have significantly improved the technology in that. We learned a lot of lessons for what worked and what didn't work from that equipment.
Do we have enough inspectors right now making sure they're adhering to this new technology and also to the new restrictions?
So if you look at it, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement in the past couple of years, they've pushed out that they've increased the number of inspections that they've done significantly with the inspectors that they have out there to be able to look at it. We've also implemented safety environmental management systems that were not required by regulation before, and so some companies did it and some didn't, and those are now required now, and that's part of what COS does, is to help ensure that those management systems are being done, and they're required to be audited every 3 years by BSEE.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And there's going to be more questions on this. I'm going to go to Governor Edwards at this time. I'm going to have to leave about 11:15 or so. Governor Barrasso will take over, so I'm going to take the privilege of just a couple extra minutes, if you don't mind. Governor Edwards, Louisiana has adopted a constitutional amendment that requires all funds it receives under Go Mesa go to the coastal relief projects. As far as I'm aware, there aren't similar requirements for the other 3 coastal states receiving Go Mesa funds. Go Mesa has some limitations about how states can use the funds, but it isn't as narrow a focus. You've spoken to the threats Louisiana faces with climate change and coastal resilience. This is going to be a 2-part, Governor, but as we look at proposals to change revenue sharing and also the caps that we have on right now with Go Mesa and adjust the Go Mesa cap, how should Congress think about how the other states would spend those funds, or should we intervene, as opposed to Louisiana where the money is directly targeted for what seems that all 4 states in the Gulf would have the same problem as coastal relief?
Thank you, Senator Manchin, for the question. I am reluctant to weigh in on how other states should spend revenue that they get from the federal government because I don't know the most pressing needs in those states, and I don't know what limitations there may be on the sharing of revenue with respect to federal lands either. I can tell you that there was a 37.5% cap and a $375 million cap as well, and then whatever funds are produced from the Gulf then get split according to a formula between the states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. And so every dollar that we get goes to coastal restoration and protection, but we know that that is a pressing need. We've identified at least $50 billion worth of investments we want to make over 50 years. This is the only guaranteed source of federal revenue that goes into that program every single year for the life of Go Mesa. So it's incredibly important for us, and we're doing really good work on the coast. I hope that maybe you and other members of the committee will come down and we can show you the islands that we're building, the shoreline protection projects that are really having a positive impact. The hurricane that we talked about earlier, Laura, was projected to have storm surge over I-10 in Lake Charles. That didn't happen, and we believe one of the reasons it didn't happen is because of the work that we've done along the coast, particularly the shoreline protection project. So these projects are really important to us, but we have a long way to go in lifting that cap and allowing more revenue to flow to the states, comparable to what's happening on federal lands, would be very beneficial to the state of Louisiana.
Thank you, Governor. Senator Barrasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor Edwards, 2 weeks ago, Mark Gordon, Governor of Wyoming, was here, testified before this very committee. He testified on the impact of President Biden's oil and gas leasing ban on Wyoming and western states. Could you talk just a little bit more about what the oil and gas leasing ban means for the energy workers and communities in Louisiana and across the Gulf?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Senator Barrasso, for the question. We know that in just the first half an hour after the pause was announced, the share prices for companies doing business in the Gulf of Mexico was adversely affected. And so there have been challenges already. We know, for example, that lease sales that haven't happened, that's another source of revenue that comes to Louisiana so we've lost some revenue there. The biggest, there are existing leases, as you know, and the permits are being issued in time for exploration there. But if this pause really turns into something that's longer than the word pause suggests, we know that it will have a tremendously adverse impact on our state. So just to give you the numbers, we're a top 10 oil producing state and a top 5 natural gas producing state, and that does not count what comes out of the Gulf of Mexico. We have 1/5 of the nation's refining capacity in Louisiana. I told you 55% of all LNG exports came out of Louisiana. And when you add it all up, between exploration and production, the fabrication, the servicing, the refining, the chemical manufacturing, 250,000 Louisianans. Now, we only have 4.6 million. 250,000 Louisianans are employed in this industry. It is responsible for about 26% of our gross domestic product and produces another $4.5 billion in state and local revenue. So that's how big this industry is, Senator. And so if this, and I don't mind the word pause, because pause, I think by definition, suggests that there's going to be a resumption. And we want the resumption, we want it as soon as possible, so that the worst impacts don't happen and that these people don't lose their chance at supporting themselves and their families.
Thank you, Governor. Mr. Menarvik, kind of following up a little bit on something the Governor just said, you know, officials within the Biden administration have repeatedly claimed that oil and gas producers stockpile federal oil and gas leases and permits. Is stockpiling oil and gas leases and permits in federal waters even allowed under current law?
Thank you, Senator. No, clearly not. There's clear terms on which we have to develop the lease, or we return it back to the government. It's definitely a use it or lose it proposition. When we buy a lease in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of money left to be invested and a lot of analysis and technology that has to be applied to determine exactly what we have discovered, or what we potentially will be drilling for, and what opportunity is there. Typically in the Gulf, you spend about $1 million to $2 million to purchase a lease. That's been the average over the last decade or so. But you're going to spend millions of dollars beyond that as you invest and review and study seismic data and do economic analysis and look at the cost to drill. In the deep water today, a well can cost $100 million. And different from a lot of the onshore areas, it can very likely be a dry hole. So $100 million and you get no return of your capital. That's a potential outcome. So a lot of money is invested along the way to analyze that opportunity, reprocessing seismic data with enhanced computer technology that we have today to really dive in and really understand what we've leased. So sometimes those leases don't get drilled. That's the reality of it. But when we're looking at investments of $100 million of risk dollars, they'll ultimately result in potentially $1 billion of capital to develop the fields fully. This is the kind of analysis and commitment that has to be made.
Can I ask you a little bit more in terms of what you just mentioned, the word investment? You know, in March, the governor of New Mexico wrote to President Biden on the impact of his oil and gas leasing ban on federal lands. She explained the leasing ban is going to encourage oil and gas producers to leave federal lands in New Mexico for private and state lands in Texas. The result is going to be, of course, fewer jobs, less revenue for New Mexico, more jobs, higher revenue for Texas. Is it fair to say that if the Biden leasing ban does not end soon, offshore oil and gas producers will shift their investments from U.S. waters to other parts of the world? And is it fair to say that that shift is going to mean fewer jobs for Americans and less revenue for states and the federal government?
Thank you, Senator, and absolutely, that is the case. We have seen that already in our company. We had a rig working, and we decided we'd pick up a second rig, which is staff, which is about 100 people, and we had trouble getting the people to get on that rig and come to work. And part of the reason was they saw a lot of uncertainty in leaving their current position they were working in and committing to a higher wage job in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's true among capital providers, shareholders, and investors across the board. The chilling impact of what's been done already in the Biden administration with the immediate reduction in drilling permits for 60 days. It was processed. It's the fear that's out there, the chilling effect of those statements, this pause concept, and how long the leasing ban is going to continue is of great concern to the industry and capital providers. And as you mentioned, the company's investors have pulled back from these types of companies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. Mr. Manarovic.
Yes, ma'am.
Let me follow up here because I'm trying to understand. I'm from Nevada. We don't have a lot of oil and gas. So for purposes of your unused permits, how many does your company have that are actually, you have permits for drilling and or leases, but they're unused right now?
Yeah, right now we have about 40 permits that are in place in order to drill wells.
Does the pause impact those 40?
No, ma'am, it does
Okay,
not.
and then to move those forward in production, does the pause impact that?
Yes, I would say it does. And
Why?
the reason for is
Yeah.
because we have investors. So we're investing a couple $100 million a year in the Gulf of Mexico. And our investors are concerned about the regulatory environment in which we'll be putting those a couple $100 million to work. And so that's what I have to get them over the hurdle of uncertainty associated with a commitment to drill the well. It doesn't impact the permit. The permit's there. It's the commitment of the capital that makes the difference.
Okay, and then how many new leases are you interested in pursuing that you've been prevented from pursuing because of this pause?
You know, historically, we're not big oil and gas purchasers of leases. We've purchased about 142 over the history of the company, but we look at buying about 5 or 6 per year.
Are there any right now that you're preventing from pursuing because of this pause?
Absolutely. We've identified a dozen or more leases that we would like to evaluate and potentially bid on in 2021.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
Yes,
that.
ma'am.
Governor Edwards, great to see you again. Let me ask you, in your testimony, you mentioned both a need to transition away from oil and gas consumption and that we cannot ignore the impacts from climate change, while noting your state's reliance on the funds derived from these revenues and how they are also used to mitigate against coastal degradation. In your testimony, you also mentioned that it is important to have a responsible transition period for continued production and use of oil and gas resources that allows places like your state and others to reposition themselves for a future sustainable economy. How do you envision the federal government aiding states like yours in such a transition? And what plans in your is your state looking into to plan for that future?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Senator. So we believe that orderly transition is going to require some predictability and certainty, and the pause works against that. And I will tell you that I will adopt by reference all of the things that Mr. Manarovic said about oil produced in the Gulf being carbon advantaged. And so it's not, I know some people would say, you know, it sounds like you're speaking out of both sides of your mouth when you're talking about the climate change impacts on Louisiana and the need to move towards transition to cleaner fuel sources, but at the same time producing out of the OCS. But we know that the demand is inelastic, and so the supply will be met from sources where more greenhouse gases will be emitted and into the environment. And so we think these things work hand in hand. And we use, as I've mentioned already, all of the revenue we get from production in the Gulf to actually work along our coast to restore the coast and to put in protection projects, levees, and things like that. So this transition period, and I don't think anybody can say precisely how long it's going to take, a number of years, a couple of decades, but throughout this transition period, I envision the state of Louisiana moving in the direction that the Climate Initiative Task Force mentioned, where by 2050 we're going to cut greenhouse gas emissions to net zero relative to 2005 levels. We're going to use that time to develop a wind energy sector of our economy in Louisiana, to develop hydrogen, to do more around carbon capture and sequestration. We have tremendous opportunities. And by the way, money is being spent today in Louisiana on these things. These are not theoretical concepts. These are very real. And so we're going to use this opportunity to transition towards less carbon-intensive fuel sources while developing these other sectors of our economy. But that requires predictability, and we don't really have that when you have a pause and you don't know the duration of it.
Okay, thank you. I know my time's up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Panel members.
Thanks, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Cassidy.
Senator Narvik, I just want to ask you to answer briefly, but you mentioned in your testimony that as regards life cycle, global greenhouse gas emissions, producing oil and gas out of the Gulf of Mexico for the United States has the lowest greenhouse gas emission profile per unit of energy. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. According to the Wood Mackenzie study, the only country that was close was Saudi Arabia, and that study did not include transportation of the oil back to the United States. So, but the other importers that we use, Canada in particular, it exposes us to a lot of extra greenhouse gas emissions by importing oil from Canada relative to the Gulf of Mexico.
And I think I know from an Obama-era study that when we add those life cycle costs of transportation to the oil and gas brought in from Saudi, their emissions profile is worse than ours.
That was stated in a 2016 BOEM report prepared under the Obama administration.
So one more time, if you want to, since we know people are going to be using oil and gas, if you're producing oil and gas out of the Gulf of Mexico, it has the lowest greenhouse gas emission profile of per unit of energy that comes to our shore than any place else that oil and gas comes from in the U.S. or from around the world.
We got to get our oil from the Gulf of Mexico. And, you know, we have talked for decades about economic security associated with domestic production. We've talked about energy security, about the ability for us to control international events because of our production of domestic oil and gas. Now we need to talk about greenhouse gas emissions and producing our oil under tightly regulated environments that allow us to produce the cleanest barrel in the world as we go through this transition.
One more thing, you ready?
Yes, sir.
Now, there's obviously a lot of tension worldwide. How do you create good-paying jobs for wherever you live, but let's say Americans, who don't necessarily have an advanced degree? Good people, but they're hardworking, but they don't have a PhD in solar engineering. Looking at your workforce, not the engineers, I'm just talking about the folks that go out to the rig, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. What is the average amount of money they earn?
Yes, Senator, thank you for asking that. We have a wonderful staff of very qualified, technically driven people that work offshore every day in our operations. 200 of them are related to
Fast, man. How much?
Sorry, $100,000. We have
$100,000 for a guy that only has a high school education, but he's hardworking, and he's sending his kid off to better schools to have a better future?
Yes, sir.
Wow. We need more of those jobs.
Yes, sir.
Governor,
Yes, sir.
our state was pounded by Katrina. We've been hit by multiple hurricanes since. We need to restore our coastline. Now tell us, if you don't mind, how these dollars leverage BP oil dollars in order to contribute to our coastal restoration plan.
Thank you, Senator. So there are a couple of pots of funding under the BP oil spill settlement that the state of Louisiana benefits from that work on a reimbursement basis. So if we don't have the dollars in the first instance to pay for the project, we don't have a project to be reimbursed for, and that's specifically the NERDA and the NIPWIF pots of funding. So it is important.
So the GOMESA dollars provide that matching
Yes.
sum.
Yes.
And now tell me, how much is our coastal restoration plan over the next 50 years, i.e. the plan to prevent us from having another Hurricane Katrina whack New Orleans? How much does that cost?
It is a minimum of $50 billion.
50 with a B.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Lefton, here we've heard about fantastic jobs, $100,000 for folks who may have a high school education only, but they're great people, and they're getting a better future for their family. We have the lowest emission profile per unit of energy produced hitting our shores than any place in the nation, and it's providing matching dollars to rebuild our coastline. How long will this pause last, and why is it even being considered?
Well, thank you, Senator. As I said in my testimony, we have a responsibility to the American public to review our programs to ensure that they do amount to a fair return to the American taxpayer. So that is exactly what we are doing.
So is the question that we need to raise the royalty payments? I don't quite understand, because
Well,
right
actually-
now, onshore gets a far better royalty payments going to the states, less to the federal, and here the federal government's getting more of a reward.
So actually, Senator, I believe you're referring to the revenue sharing.
Correct.
So I think it's critical first to acknowledge that 90% of those revenues are actually coming from royalties. So that means as
Coming from-
production continues.
Coming from where?
From royalties. So that means as production continues, which we expect it would, in fact, 55% of the 12 million acres that are under lease in the Gulf of Mexico, we don't even have a plan for yet. 80% of that acreage is not yet currently producing. So there's plenty of opportunity for what is currently.
But that assumes that this pause is going to end in the near term.
No, sir, it doesn't.
Because as we've heard, you chill investment as long as there's this uncertainty going forward.
Well, fortunately, actually, we're still seeing plans come into BOEM, and we are processing those plans.
No,
so
but
that,
not for new
so that
leases, though.
development.
The issue is the new leases.
Well, we would have plans for leasing, right? So there are existing acreage under lease, and then what happens?
What I'm hearing from our oil field service folks is that as long as there is a pause, no one will invest in new capacity.
And-
Now, and 250,000 people in our state are directly or indirectly employed in this. Are you committing to us that the administration will once again begin to lease in the Gulf of Mexico?
I'm committing to you, sir, that we will have an interim report that is going to be out in the early summertime, and very glad to continue the conversation.
I'll finish with this. If you're speaking of the American public as 250,000 workers, some of them earning $100,000 with a college degree, including the construction jobs, rebuilding our coastline so we don't get whacked by more hurricanes, that American public says resume leasing. If you're speaking to the American public benefiting from the Great American Outdoors Act, which is rebuilding our nation's parks, or from the Land Water Conservation Fund, which depends on this funding, they are saying resume leasing. I yield back. I'm just frustrated by this kind of inaction.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Holmes, I'm a little unclear. Who is it that you work for? What is this, a government agency or a private sector? Who is it?
Center for Offshore Safety is supported by a group of the offshore oil and gas companies. It's a industry-sponsored group for the industry.
I just wanted that clarification. Sometimes I hate to be right. 3 years ago, I sat right here and cross-examined a representative from Ferc about the failure to adequately regulate pipelines because of the cyber threat. I can guarantee that your systems are vulnerable to cyber attack today. Whatever you tell me, I can guarantee that Putin's hackers could be in there within several weeks. Your SCADA systems are vulnerable. The valves, turnings are vulnerable. What kind of strong systems do you have in place? Well, let me rephrase the question. Would you accept regulation by the Ferc or some other agency of the federal government to ensure cyber protection? Because right now, you're vulnerable, and we just saw this weekend what that can mean.
Senator, yes. I think a collaborative approach between the industry and the whole of government is necessary across the entire nation for cybersecurity. In my last role in the Coast Guard, I oversaw the Gulf of Mexico Area Maritime Security Committee, and safety and security are two sides of the same coin, and within the security side, you have both physical security and cybersecurity. Our last couple of exercises over the last couple of years centered on the cyber side of cybersecurity for both information sharing. We would partner with the oil and natural gas ISIC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, that has really increased information sharing over the last couple of years. And within our different exercises, the oil and gas companies would practice and work to find their vulnerabilities on their cyber systems and how to improve them on a regular basis.
Well, I hope you will continue that work, and Mr. Maranovic, I hope you will take this seriously. We keep getting wake-up calls,
Yes, sir.
and we keep not being fully awake. So I can't emphasize more how serious this threat is. I've spent the last 2 years as a co-chair of a National Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and what's come through to me is the urgency of this problem, and it just, we keep learning how serious it is. I assume you're heavily focused on this threat.
Yes, sir, and obviously the colonial situation brought it to a new level. Our IT department this morning actually updated us on some methods that we're using. We're backing up our data regularly. Of course, we also have an off-site facility in Indianapolis to have backups put separately from our Houston location. We have blocked all access outside of the United States, and we have a two-factor authority to access that data.
I think that's crucial because we don't yet know the cause of colonial, but it's likely somebody clicked on a phishing email.
That's right.
I mean, we can do all that we can do here, but cybersecurity starts on the desktop. And
Absolutely.
It's a culture within the company. I hope that I would urge you to, for example, hire hackers or red teams
Right.
to test your systems, because your CIO tells you you're secure, but you don't know it until somebody tries to break in.
I agree with you, Senator, and we've done that a little bit in the past, but certainly this has elevated it. We'll take your advice.
Thank you. Governor, welcome. Governor Manchin and I always welcome governors because they're the font of most wisdom in our experience. We're always glad to have you here. Do you think a state should have the right to say no to offshore drilling off of their coast if their legislature and governor make a determination that they feel the risks outweighs the costs?
I do. That's not the decision we made in Louisiana.
I understand.
Yes, sir. But I do think that a state should be able to make that decision.
Thank you. Ms. Lefton, offshore wind, a couple of suggestions. One is, we talk about offshore wind, but in this country, that usually means onshore wind in the water with water up 50 feet or 100 feet. In other words, it's a pylon in the water. The real future of offshore wind is in floating platforms. And as you know, the University of Maine is working on an experimental program. A couple of things. We've got to work out the compatibility of these facilities with traditional industries like fishing and, in my case, lobstering. The other thing I would urge you to attend to is to think about an offshore grid so that each offshore wind project doesn't have to develop its own grid system to enter the grid. We don't have multiple landing places. Quite often, we may want that power to be DC rather than AC because of lower environmental impacts. Therefore, fewer places to come ashore could be very important. So we're in a period now where I hope that your agency will be thinking about planning not only for the offshore wind, but also for how that power is going to get ashore and how to develop that grid as part of the infrastructure plan that we're discussing.
Well, Senator, thank you very much. We are in fact thinking of just very that, and I agree with you that both we need to ensure that we are doing all that we can to deconflict with existing ocean users, and that we need a very thoughtful approach to transmission to minimize impact and ensure that we have adequate transmission to bring this energy to shore. So undoubtedly, those are two things that we remain very focused on, and I appreciate you raising them.
Thank you. And my time has expired, but I want to say the overall purpose here is to keep Wyoming and Nevada from becoming coastal states.
Indeed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator King. We appreciate your attention to our states. Grateful. Senator Daines.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. Before I get to questions, I'd like to briefly highlight the events surrounding the Colonial Pipeline hack. As we all know, the hacking and subsequent shutdown of the Colonial Pipeline by Russian-connected groups has caused gas shortages in many southeastern states. First, I think we need to take aggressive action to hold these bad actors accountable and empower infrastructure companies to protect their networks. But this attack also highlights another problem. Across the eastern seaboard, particularly the southeast, we are seeing panic and worry at gas shortages grow in communities. The long lines remind me of the early 70s when we had inflation, 55-mile-an-hour speed limits, and lines around blocks for gasoline. We need to be doing everything we can to avoid these types of panic at the pump scenarios. Thankfully, because of policies of the last administration, we are still global energy dominant. And thankfully now that the pipeline is back up and running, this shortage will cease. However, because of President Biden's war on Made in America energy, we may see gas shortages become a norm and not the result of bad actors. We need to be promoting an all-of-the-above energy portfolio. We need to build the Keystone XL pipeline. I was out in eastern Montana last week, and it's just tragic to see these communities, frankly, bordering on poverty, that need these jobs, need this economic activity. We have 2.5 million miles of pipeline. I don't know why President Biden stopped that pipeline. We need it. We need to approve new oil and gas leases. We don't need to stifle American energy. But I want to now turn to the hearing and how President Biden's actions are already affecting our communities. Last year, we passed that historic Great American Outdoors Act, and I want to thank my colleague from Maine, Angus King, who was a great partner in working together to get that strong bipartisan support to get that done. That bill uses energy revenues from onshore and offshore energy development to fix the aging infrastructure at our parks. This bill brought Republicans, Democrats, independents together to increase conservation funding by using our robust energy economy to fund our parks and our public lands. But the actions of President Biden to stop leasing and his desire to end oil and gas development permanently can and will have a negative effect on the good work that Congress did last year, including on our national parks. Ms. Lufton, the leasing ban is already having an effect on the revenue generated from federal lands that would go to our parks. The longer Interior and the President keep the ban going, the more harmful that effect will be. How can this administration reconcile their desire to increase conservation and support our parks at the same time you're taking actions to kill off the main source of revenue for restoring our parks and our public lands?
Well, Senator, thank you for the question. Clearly, I can't speak to the onshore program, but I can tell you for offshore and what we regulate at BOEM that 90% of the revenues from oil and gas come from royalties. So we know that there is continued production that is continuing in the Gulf of Mexico, and therefore there's continued revenue that's coming in to support things like LWCF, as you're mentioning, Senator. So we see no impact to those funds at this time and appreciate you raising it.
Well, thanks for that. And you say at this time, I guess we're thinking about the longer-term implications. It's having a chilling effect. In fact, today we're seeing sales and pipeline leases stopped. Next, where they're headed next will be stopping production and the revenue it generates. And with wind and solar not generating the revenue needed for conservation, it's only time before the parks will begin to suffer. I want to turn to the 30 by 30 initiative. Several months ago, the Biden administration announced their goal of protecting 30% of all lands and waters by 2030. Montana has a legacy of conservation, which I fully support, but the lack of details on this initiative were deeply concerning. The administration refused to answer questions or meet with me to discuss 30 by 30, initially didn't even make their report public on how they would achieve that goal. Once the report was public, it contained high-level concepts and buzzwords to detract from the lack of information and contradictory statements. While the administration is adamant about placing 30% of lands in, quote, conservation status, they concede they do not know how to define conservation, and even if they did, they have no idea how many lands are already in this status. This leads me, frankly, to fear the worst, that President Biden will unilaterally lock up lands and waters from future development. Governor Edwards, what are your thoughts on the potential use of federal laws to unilaterally inhibit energy development in order to meet vague conservation goals, and how could a designation like this affect a state like Louisiana?
Well, Senator, thank you for the question, and you know, I'm trying to figure out exactly how to phrase the answer. Obviously, we know that oil and gas, the oil and gas industry, like all businesses, like stability and predictability, and there is a cadence associated with how they develop leases. First of all, you got to be able to get the lease, and then you've got to put it in line for development. And any time that you have an abrupt pause like we have right now, that's going to have an adverse impact on their ability to maintain that cadence. And the longer the pause lasts, the greater the interruption and the harder it's going to be to overcome that, and the more adverse the impacts and so forth. And so obviously I acknowledge that the president has inherent authority to review things. I'm just hopeful that the review will come out consistent with what the discussion has been here today, especially by my senator, Senator Cassidy. And I'm mindful that the current 5-year plan for development in the OCS was developed by the Obama administration in 2016, and it's pretty clear. It says that greenhouse gas emissions will increase if you stop drilling in the Gulf and in the OCS, because you're going to deprive the market of these carbon-advantaged barrels of oil, and instead allow these barrels of oil from elsewhere in the world to come into the market, because the demand isn't going to change. And so I'm actually optimistic that will be the same conclusion that they're going to draw, because it seems irrefutable to me. I just wish they would get there and create the policy and the program going forward, lift the pause. You know, I don't know if that answered your question.
It does, and thank you for staying focused on the science and the data, and not ideology and politics. It's appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. Being from a Gulf state, I'm very excited about the conversation today. You know, it is such a part of our economy. It's such a part of, just for generations, the livelihood that our people in Mississippi have been able to enjoy. But Governor Edwards, what kind of shift in revenue and substance economic daily activity of lives of Louisianans can you describe to us if we continue to see the Gulf Coast state leasing or continue to be paused? How's that going to affect the state of Louisiana and all the Gulf states economically, of just the everyday lives of the people that we represent?
Well, thank you very much, Senator Hyde-Smith. We know that the revenue sharing will diminish over time because the lease sales aren't happening, and the production will decrease, and therefore we're going to have less opportunities to fix our coast and to protect coastal communities. And we know that we need to do more and not less. We also know that we will shed jobs in the not too distant future if the pause isn't lifted. And I mentioned that all in, direct and indirect, it's about 250,000 jobs in a state that has about 2 million people working. And so this is very significant for a state like Louisiana. And by the way, the very same companies that fabricate offshore oil platforms and service them, they can also fabricate offshore wind platforms and service them too. In fact, they're already doing it. The Block Island wind project in the Northeast, we had Louisiana people up there applying their experience, their know-how to get that done. We can develop these things simultaneously, but if you pull the rug out from the traditional oil and gas too abruptly, and the pause lasts for too long, then that transition is not going to be seamless. It's going to be haphazard, and we're going to hurt too many people and the state economy in the process.
Thank you, and we certainly share those concerns as well as our borders. And Ms. Lepton, as we all very aware of, the Gulf of Mexico oil and gas leasing, it is just truly under attack from the Biden administration, in my opinion, the moratoriums are. And we've discussed the studies, the API study, which was performed to analyze the fallout of the long-term moratoriums on oil and gas and natural gas productions. But as it turns out, my state is greatly affected. As I've already mentioned, at least 2,000 jobs under a 4-year moratorium, and more than 4,000, obviously, under an 8-year moratorium. That is just in Mississippi alone, and 157,000 jobs affected in a 4-year moratorium. But given the detrimental impact that this pause is causing to our states, how do you view the Gulf of Mexico in terms of American oil and gas production now and in the future? And when do you think the administration should lift this?
Sure. Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. First, let me say, my mic is on. First, let me say, we do, of course, share the goal of supporting jobs and supporting American jobs. I think it's first perhaps important to note that there's a little bit more of a nuanced story here, and that's that we're actually seeing decline of jobs in the oil and gas industry over the years. In the past 4 years in particular, in fact, we've seen a decline in jobs. I think it's really important that we think about, well, what's our opportunities then going forward? And Governor Edwards just spoke to one of those, which is how can we help transition communities to support new and growing industries like offshore wind? Just recently, we announced the Vineyard Wind Project, which is going to create 3,600 jobs. And I'm hopeful that we can build a supply chain that's going to support businesses in the Gulf and other places that know how to do energy development in the OCS. The last thing I'll say, of course, Senator, is we are working quickly on the review. We also acknowledge that there's quite a bit of production that continues. And as I stated earlier, in fact, 55% of acreage under lease currently, we don't even have an exploration plan for. Only 80% of the lease, of the acreage under lease is actually producing at this time. So I think there is not only plenty of opportunity to continue to have robust production in the Gulf, but also a great opportunity to create new jobs for the future.
So you don't have a time frame of when you think that this freeze should be lifted?
Well, most certainly we will see the outcome of the interim report in the early summertime, and we will continue to drive towards an expeditious decision.
At that point. Thank you.
Senator Murkowski.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. To our witnesses, thank you for being here, for your testimony. I appreciate it. There's so much here, and I had a conversation with Senator Cassidy coming in about it sometimes stuns me to think about the resources that we have as a nation, our opportunities to not only provide for an economy and jobs, but resources that our nation needs and our friends and allies want, and yet sometimes we put in place policies that just handcuff us in our ability to do much of anything. And we've heard some of those matters discussed before this committee in just these past couple months. Ms. Lefton, I want to begin with you. Back in November, under the previous administration, the Department of Interior announced a proposal to update the so-called Arctic Rule with regards to offshore development in both the Chukchi and the Beaufort. The Biden administration has withdrawn this proposal. The fact of the matter is that the 2020 rule, the proposed 2020 rule, went through a pretty collaborative and an open process, building on years of data, best practices, operating in Arctic conditions. And yet the administration comes in, and in relatively short order, literally a matter of months, with trying to understand if there was really any process or any level of outreach to stakeholders by the department between the time that the new administration came in and the time that the proposed rule was rescinded. So you're moving beyond the process, the efficiencies, the workplace safety improvements that, again, were built after years of research and data of operating within the region. So as one who, again with Senator Daines, we want people to stay focused on the science and on the data, it is difficult to understand how the administration can come in and basically just throw that all away in a very quick, very abbreviated process and say, nope, we're not even going to go there. So can you speak to that very briefly?
Well, Senator, thank you so much for the question. Greatly appreciate you. I'll say that what we saw with the Arctic Rule is that really, it was an opportunity or I would say the motivation for the proposed article from the previous administration was to streamline the process. And we look at the previous article, which remains in place today, and we see that there are very appropriate protections that are in place in that rule. Therefore, we sought to withdraw the Arctic rule proposed by the previous administration to ensure the previous one remains in place.
So is it fair to say that the department continues to support the development of Alaska's offshore oil and gas resources?
There are existing lease holdings certainly in the Arctic, and that production, of course, can continue with those leaseholders. There's nothing that is preventing that exploration now.
Well, in fairness, we're not doing much off of the North Slope when it comes to our offshore. And I hope that you know that.
I am aware of the lease holdings currently, yes.
Yes, it's not as if we have a lot of activity going on there. I'd like to ask about the 5-year plan. Back in 2018, Secretary Zinke announced a plan to open 90% of the OCS to oil and gas leasing. Projected time horizon was approximately 2019 to 2024. I was one of those members of Congress who supported that plan. The plan included 19 proposed lease sales in the state of Alaska. Can you share with the committee what the department's plans are for offshore oil and gas development in Alaska?
Certainly. So, of course, as you've noted, Senator, the previous administration did not complete their plan. They had put out a draft proposed plan and a notice of a programmatic environmental impact statement. So at this time, as we continue to do the review of our oil and gas programs, that will certainly inform the 5-year program going forward, which we certainly do intend to develop and are very glad to continue the conversation with you as that occurs.
Last question, Mr. Chairman, if I may. A lot of discussion last year about what this committee was able to advance with permanent reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I think we have recognized the benefits that have come through the Great American Outdoors Act. I had some concerns about the mandatory funding for LWCF, including how we pay for it. But we all recognize that LWCF derives from oil and gas royalties, but we're looking at an administration now that is not very enthusiastic about development on our public lands. So as Interior is reviewing the oil and gas program, is it considering the impacts to LWCF and the other conservation programs that exist out there if royalties from oil and gas are either no longer available or are starting to decline? Because believe you me, we're using that money. We're going to spend these for these conservation projects. But is the administration actually looking at that the impact of the policies that they're talking about today, when you're pausing this kind of activity and you're going in a different direction, that it's not consistent with the efforts that you would like to make on the conservation side?
Well, certainly. I mean, first, deeply appreciate the question with respect to LWCF and the goals of that fund. It is such critical conservation dollars for this nation, and highly value the great work that this committee and others did to secure that. As we continue with the review, undoubtedly, we need to ensure that we're looking at revenues for LWCF, for GMESA, for all of those things that are out there. As I stated before, as you well know, Senator, of course, and as you said as well, the majority of those funds for LWCF come from royalties. So as we continue to see production, which we expect that we will see continued production on our public lands and waters for many years to come. There are many existing leases. We do expect that LWCF will continue to be supported, but it is undoubtedly something that we should continue to look at together, and I appreciate you raising the question.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski. I think Senator Hickenlooper is on from his office.
I am on, and thank you all the panelists for a really illuminating session. Appreciate you all taking the time to come down here. Especially as a former governor, I appreciate Governor Edwards, you're taking the time out. I know how busy you are, and appreciate your comments very much. You've committed your state to achieving net zero carbon by 2050. And as you said in your testimony, this is going to require significant investment in renewables and electric vehicles, other innovative options. But we're also we need to address emissions in other industries that are, well, harder to innovate. I think we need to look at both sides of the ledger. I mean, reducing emissions in the first place, as well as the negative emissions technology like carbon capture or direct air capture. I wanted to hear your perspective on this and what your state's doing on carbon capture, and how can Congress do a better job of supporting those efforts?
Thank you so much, Senator Hickenlooper. First of all, you all have already done a lot with the 45Q tax credit around carbon capture and sequestration, and I think you may have some more legislation you're considering that would actually make that more attractive for entities to invest in. Louisiana has tremendous potential for carbon capture, and the reason is we're the only state in the nation where the largest portion of our CO2 emissions don't come from power generation. They come from refining and chemical manufacturing. And it's easier to capture in that environment. We also have the pipeline density to transport the carbon once it's captured, and the geologic formations underground to store it for hundreds or thousands of years. And we are already seeing investment come into Louisiana around carbon capture and sequestration. And so I think your point is exactly right, and that's something we're pursuing in a robust way right now. I mentioned in my opening statement the most recent project where we're actually going to, in Caldwell Parish, Louisiana, refine diesel out of pine tree waste and capture the carbon that is emitted in that refining process and sequester it in geologic formation that are underground in the immediate vicinity of the refinery. That is the wave of the future, and we are moving in that direction, and that's just one example. There are many others, but I think your point is exactly right. And we need to see whether direct capture is something that's feasible in Louisiana as well, and that's something that we're looking at, Senator. But what the Congress can do is continue to make sure that the business plan works, and the 45Q tax credit, I think, is the linchpin for that.
Great. I appreciate that. And on the same direction that obviously we all agree that we need to reduce carbon emissions dramatically. In Colorado, especially on the west side of the state, we are economically tied to fossil fuel extraction, jobs and people's livelihoods. I know that's true also in Louisiana. We need to look at the greater good for all the individuals that are affected during this transition. And I wanted to hear some of your perspectives on how you're addressing fossil fuel dependent communities as we move into a modern energy economy.
Well, that is a great question, and it is something that we are working on by making sure, as I mentioned earlier, that those individuals, those companies currently working to fabricate, for example, offshore oil platforms, that they actually can engage in the fabrication of offshore wind platforms. And service companies and vessels can be engaged in the same types of services, just for windmills rather than for drilling rigs. But that's the sort of thing that we can do in Louisiana, and over the transition, in an orderly way, devote more and more resources to building up the new energy industry that we believe is coming. And by the way, I don't think we're ever going to get totally away from oil and gas. I don't think that works, and a lot of people have no idea what it is that we manufacture out of natural gas, for example, everything from fertilizer to this bottle. So we're never going to get totally away from it, and that manufacturing is going to have to continue. But those are the things we're doing. When General Motors says that by 2035 it's not going to produce another non-electric vehicle, that's a serious cue for a state like Louisiana that you better broaden your horizons and start doing things in a different in a different way, and certainly that's what we're going to do in Louisiana.
No, I appreciate that. I'm out of time. Sorry I'm not there in person, just because, well, I respect you guys so much. And Ms. Lefton, at some point, maybe at a later date, I would love to get caught up on your ideas of how we can improve the siting and permitting for these offshore wind systems that you describe in your testimony. So we'll put that off down the road. I'm out of time, but thank you all for your efforts. I yield back to the
Thank
chair.
you. Thank you very much, Senator. A number of members have requested a second round of questions. I'm going to start just with one from Ms. Lefton. During her confirmation hearing, now Secretary Holland committed to being transparent and engaging with all stakeholders. The department hasn't contacted me at all or my staff to discuss the leasing program. The department has not responded to a letter that I sent on March 22nd, and it's now May 13th. And I requested answers at the time on the federal leasing moratorium. Even the Bureau of Land Management's website that publicly tracks the applications for permits to drill has been offline now for 3 weeks. So what does the Bureau need to take in terms of the next steps to reinstate the federal oil and gas leasing program?
Well, Senator, very much appreciate the question and your input, of course. First, I want to talk a little bit about some of the input that we have received. On March 25th, we held a forum as a department in which we heard from industry representatives, from labor representatives, communities, environmental justice communities, tribal nations, and other stakeholders about our oil and gas programs, which I thought was a very informative and helpful forum where we learned quite a bit. Additionally, we provided the opportunity for the public at large to provide written feedback, and we received actually over 100,000 comments during that time period. In addition to that, we've consulted with governors, we've talked to members of Congress, we've had many conversations with stakeholders, and with respect to your letter, Senator, and your input, I'm certain, of course, that we've taken into consideration, and I'm sure that we'll follow up with you. And as we continue to move towards this review and come out with an interim report in the early summertime, we will, of course, summarize the feedback that we've heard from our partners and our stakeholders alike.
Well, as you talk about summarizing the feedback, really in the interest of transparency and accountability, is the department going to make the comments submitted by that for that March 25th virtual forum? You're going to make those all public?
Yes.
So not just a summary, but you're actually going to make the comments public.
Correct.
Thank you. I think, let's see, Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Several things. First, it's been brought to my attention that per federal law, any revenue derived from GOMESA that distributes to the 4 states in the Gulf has to be used for hurricane protection or to mitigate damages caused by oil and gas development. So Senator Manchin's opening questions to my governor suggested that perhaps some of the other states had not done so. The only thing we've done additionally in Louisiana, we've codified it in our state constitution. But this money in all those 4 states is being used for that environmental purpose. I also want to point that out. Secondly, we speak of, well, Mr. Menarvik, let me ask you. The governor mentioned that demand for oil and gas will remain. Can you briefly tell us what independent statements, nothing against my Democratic governor, we occasionally disagree, but what independent analysis states that there will be at least a constant or growing demand for oil worldwide?
Yeah, I can speak to that. First of all, I'd like to say we've been in business 22 years, and when we started, 75 million barrels of oil was being used in this world every day. And in 2019, it was close to 100 million barrels of oil a day. So there's been a steady and rapid increase in demand from other countries like China and India and others. And the IEA has projected that it's going to be 104 and 105 in the next 5 years, and will continue to set all-time records. That may or may not be the case. I think it is, but we may be wrong. Maybe it will go down. There's a lot of projections out there. But I will tell you that the best place we can get oil is from the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. And because of the economic security, because it puts people to work, because we generate our own royalties and fund all these wonderful programs, and most importantly, I think because it has lower greenhouse gases. We regulate our own oil. If I got a second, I'd like to reference a letter that was sent 3 years ago when oil prices were about the same. 4 Democratic senators sent a letter to President Trump and asked him to pressure OPEC to increase production because it was having impact on the domestic economic conditions. They summarized by saying the current run-up in world oil prices is effectively a tax on every American family's discretionary budget, except that the money goes to OPEC cartel rather than to the U.S. Treasury. Adding to the constituents' pocketbook concerns is their understanding that our nation's continued dependence on oil is at the heart of many of our nation's greatest economic, environmental, and national security challenges. That is exactly right. That is without question. And that's why we need to drill more wells in the Gulf of Mexico.
Let me also point out that it's not just oil and gas is used for transportation, for propulsion. Everything I'm touching right now is a synthetic made from a oil or gas product. The plastic, the synthetics, the carpet that we're sitting upon. If somebody is a member of PETA and they don't want to wear leather, they are wearing something which is derived from oil and gas. And so it is an essential nature. Now, Governor, you mentioned GM's saying that they're only going to use batteries by some date in the future. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record both an International Energy Agency report on the role of critical minerals in clean energy transition, and I'd also like to have an editorial from today's Wall Street Journal written by Mark Mills, who came here
Without objection.
And in this, it points out that you're going to mine the critical minerals to make these batteries, and that the intensity of environmental despoliation involved with critical minerals and the threat to our national security is quite large. Because one, the United States has almost no footprint where these are produced. They are being produced in nations with poor governance per independent evaluations, which uses a lot of natural resources to produce in an environmentally, shall we say, destructive way, as opposed to oil and gas, which has a very small footprint and in which it is typically governed, at least in the Gulf of Mexico, by environmental standards which are quite strong. We're just replacing one set of mining procedures with another set of mining procedures, one set of environmental concerns with another much larger set of environmental concerns, and secure national security for insecure national security because we're dependent upon other nations. That is from IEA, implied, stated, but in bureaucratique.
Senator King, and I apologize for skipping you there for a minute ago.
Not at all. Always a pleasure to listen to Senator Cassidy on any topic. Ms. Lifton, is BOEM considering creating something like the 5-year planning process that you have for offshore oil and gas for offshore wind so that we can have a more predictable permitting and development process?
Well, thank you, Senator. As I mentioned earlier, Executive Order 14008 directed that the Department of Interior look at our processes for siting renewable energy. And of course, for us, that biggest renewable energy, that resource is offshore wind. So BOEM has been looking internally at our procedures as well as coordinating with other federal agencies, really with an effort of creating greater certainty for the industry, for tribal governments, for other ocean users like the commercial fishing industry, so that as we have a path, we can ensure that we have a transparent process that has robust engagement from those many partners. As part of that, it is certainly a goal of mine that we have a more certain leasing process in which we can demonstrate what our future lease sales will be in various different wind energy areas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. Congress enacted the Outer Continental Shelves Land Act primarily to facilitate the federal government's leasing of its offshore minerals resources and energy resources. In this law, Congress stated expressly that offshore resources should be made available for expeditious and offshore resources and development, orderly development. Ms. Lefton, what assurances will you give us that BOEM will not impose burdensome stipulations that make new leases economically unacceptable and therefore effectively unavailable for development, contrary to clear congressional intent?
Well, certainly the OXLA is our governing statute that guides our work and our decisions, and something we take very seriously. As I said in my opening, our mission really is to develop the outer continental shelf resources in an environmentally and economically sustainable way. So when we approach our work, whether it's marine minerals, conventional oil and gas, renewable energy, no matter what the resource, we certainly ensure that that's guided by science, and that's also guided by a balance of our responsibilities under OXLA, and we will absolutely commit to continuing to do that.
Thank you. The Department of Interior must go through multiple environmental analysis before a lease can even be awarded. Offshore oil and gas facilities maintain one of the smallest environmental footprints compared to onshore facilities and other industries, including transportation. Because the United States has strict regulations and the advancements in technology through industry continue to reduce the environmental footprint from offshore production, why should we stop progress on being energy independent and once again rely on foreign production that is both unsafe and less environmentally conscious? And I'll start with you, and I will ask all to respond.
Well, as you probably heard from my testimony previously, I totally agree with that position, and you're right. These centralized facilities really reduce the footprint, and we can drill wells off of one facility out to a radius of 3 miles or 4 miles, but then we'd also hook up a subsea well that's 30 or 40 or 50 miles away and bring that onto that central facility. It's that small footprint that allows us to really manage our greenhouse gases.
Captain Holmes?
So that's a great point about the consolidation of the different facilities. For the numbers that are out there over the years, they've definitely shrunk. About 100, 150 each year are being decommissioned offshore. Back in the day, there were about 5,500 facilities, and right now there are less than 1,800 that are active offshore. And so just this decreasing of the footprint of what you actually physically see on the surface is one of the ways. Also, with technology over the years, it's really allowed us to minimize the amount of emissions that are occurring, and then we continue to look at ways of how we can do that safely as well.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Obviously, getting back to what you asked, I don't think we should move in the direction that would cause us to move away from exploration and production in the Gulf in a way that would undermine our national security, our energy independence, and damage the environment. I just think it's very clear that if we do that, there will be more, not less, greenhouse gas emissions. And so the proposition that we're going to clean up our environment by potentially not continuing to explore and produce in the Gulf, I think is ill-founded, and so we certainly shouldn't do that.
Ms. Lefton?
It's such a thoughtful question, Senator. As I think about my response, maybe sort of starting globally, we know that climate change is a crisis that's before us now. And we know that in order for us to combat climate change, in order to reduce risks to states like Louisiana and many others that we've talked about today, we know we need to transition away from oil and gas. Having said that, that's something that needs to be done to reduce demand. And as we as a country reduce demand for oil and gas, we can then, of course, fight climate change. As we think about our continued reliance on oil and gas, I think we have already acknowledged here today that there's a lot of existing acreage that's under leased in the Gulf of Mexico, and also I don't want to speak for my colleagues on land, but also in our federal lands as well. And so I expect that we're going to see continued production and exploration of those resources for years to come with what is already out there. I think over time, as we transition, we have a really important responsibility to ensure that we're doing this to fight climate change. And I just want to note, we've talked about energy security, and I think another form of energy security and domestic energy is things like offshore wind. The majority of the people in the United States live in coastal cities. Let's produce power that's near those people and ensure that we're improving our energy security as a nation.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, when I think about energy security, to me, it really is this all of the above. And so, yes, wind generation should be part of that, but again, I don't think we can put ourselves in a position where we say it is only those renewable sources that go into that energy security bucket, and having the resources that we've been talking about here, the committee is so critically and important, and a recognition that that oil will be part of our economy, our global economy for years, generations to come. It may just look different how we utilize it, but I think our challenge here is to figure out, all right, if we're gonna continue to need this resource as humans, how are we going to be able to access it in the most environmentally responsible way, in a way that really works to reduce those emissions? The technologies that we have been focused on here as a committee, I think are kind of exciting, but I don't think that we should put ourselves in this position that in order to get to a low carbon and no carbon future, that oil is no longer part of our reality. I want to ask one question to you, Ms. Lefton, and this relates to the 30 by 30 proposal. I walked into the room when you were responding to a question from Senator Daines, so I may be touching on the same issue. I'm not sure, but I'm a little concerned about the approach that the administration has taken with this 30 by 30. Sounds pretty great. We all want to work to conserve our lands and our waters, but so much depends on what it is that we are defining and the standards there, and I haven't been able to get a lot of detail in terms of what the administration would consider conservation status, where the conservation would take place. In my state, we've got more federal lands than any other state in the country. Much of it is in a protected or a conserved status of some sort. And when we passed ANILCA back in 1980, one of the most comprehensive conservation laws ever, it put over 100 million acres, nearly 25% of Alaska's entire landmass, into newer expanded conservation units. So on the land side, Alaskans feel pretty strongly that we've kind of given, if you will, at the office there. But we also have many of our federal waters surrounding the state that are also included in some level of status. So can you provide to me any additional information on additional waters that the administration might seek to conserve as you're looking at this 30 by 30 goal? Have those been identified yet?
Well, thank you, Senator. So I'll say with respect to the broader 30 by 30 initiative, certainly acknowledge just really the incredible conservation efforts of your states and many states in the West, but in particular in Alaska, on the just incredible work you've done to conserve your lands and waters. I think what we saw excitingly as part of the 30 by 30 initiative is ensuring that we are sort of looking inclusively about what conservation means and capturing appropriately the working lands and other critical pieces there. With respect to federal waters, I expect that as we continue to look at what the future of our programs look like, there will be a process for identifying those. At this time, there are certainly from BOEM's perspective, we have not advance additional protections or conservations of federal waters, but I'd be glad to look into it with more detail and circle back to you, Senator.
I think it would be helpful to try to understand how the administration is defining conservation. Mm-hmm. And in terms of engagement, I would urge you to be more engaged, more open. When you say you kind of threw out a compliment there saying that, you know, what Alaskans have done to conserve our lands. In fairness, much of what we have in protected status is not because Alaskans chose it, it's because the federal government did it without consultation. Without consultation with the native peoples on whose lands who have now been denied access. It is a reality to us that that we come from a pretty special place. We recognize that, and we believe pretty strongly that we're some of the best environmental stewards out there because we choose to live in this place and raise our families and work there. So we want to take good care of it, but we also don't want to be in a situation where our ability to live, to work, to raise our families are denied because we have no economic opportunities. So if you're the strong fishing family out there, you want to know that your waters are clean. You want to know that they're sustainably managed fisheries, but you want to be able to pursue that livelihood.
Absolutely.
And so when we're talking about conservation, my fishermen now are a little bit worried about what this 30 by 30 proposal might be. There's some of the hardest core conservationists that you will have out there, but they want the ability to still be able to access our resources. And so, not coming from the Gulf, but knowing that you've got a lot of water down there, a little bit warmer than our water. But again, you have families in Louisiana that want to be able to live in this area, have good jobs, be good stewards, but also be able to access the resources that we have had, ever mindful of our environmental responsibilities. Mr. Chairman, I've gone well over my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski. Senator Hyde-Smith, any final question?
I just want to say thank you to the panel. You know, we're all trying to get to a good place. We're all trying to get to a reasonable place, and I just thank you for your efforts there. We're conscious of sustainability. We're conscious of the economic impact, of the environmental impact here, and it's pretty tough a lot of times to come testify before a committee here, and you've all done so well, and I just want you to know that I appreciate you continuing to be a part of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hyde-Smith. Thank you all, to all of our witnesses for joining this morning for this discussion. Now, some of the members had to leave or weren't able to ask all of their questions, so they're going to have until the close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record. So thanks again for being here. The committee stands adjourned.